minutes after the hour of 8 o'clock. A very good Friday night to you. Friday, June the 5th, 1987. Bob Lassiter with you until 11, as I am every weeknight right here at News Talk 57 WPLP. We'll break the show up into two segments tonight, a guest in the first segment, and then you and I will go at it a little bit later on. My guest is James F. Cumber, Jr. Mr. Cumber, welcome to WPLP. Delighted you could be with me tonight.
Well, I'm glad to be here. I understand we have something in common. We're both from New Jersey.
Well, okay, and in that case we do have something in common. Maybe we have more than one thing in common. I'm looking at a letter in front of me that you wrote to my executive producer, Joyce Bender. And if I might just very briefly read from part of it. Today, the talk radio area has become a rapidly expanding field. It is becoming more and more difficult to get the knowledgeable, well-qualified, and interesting guests that you need. Briefly, I have worked at High Frontier, a Washington, D.C.-based educational institution dealing with the Strategic Defense Initiative, and most recently at the Office of Aeronautics and Space Technology at NASA headquarters. Are you going to be an interesting guest, Mr. Cumber?
Going to try.
Okay. First of all, before everybody goes, running and hiding, we are going to talk a little bit about SDI, but not an awful lot, just to kind of set some groundwork here. Mr. Cumber, I also have before me 3 chapters of a manuscript that you're working on, and I found it a very interesting book as I sat down to read it, a terribly interesting book, as a matter of fact, and I want to cover all 3 areas that you cover primarily in the manuscript that you sent to me. And I'd like to start with the last one, actually, SDI. You're a proponent of the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars, or as I prefer to call it, the Stupid Defense Initiative.
Well, I'm not sure exactly where people get a lot of their information from, but I studied it quite in depth, and frankly, it made a lot more sense to me than some of the things we've been doing for the last 20 to 40 years. I mean, we've piled up nuclear weapons on nuclear weapons on nuclear weapons, on bombers, on submarines, on ballistic missiles. And in most cases, we have no way of stopping these things once they're launched. And frankly, I think it makes a great deal more sense to have something to stop somebody from firing these things and killing us than does to keep piling up and threatening to kill them.
Let me clarify something. You said, we've been piling up these nuclear weapons on top of nuclear weapons now for almost 4 decades. That happens to be true, but also in your manuscript, you justify that.
To a certain extent, yes.
Not to a certain extent. You justify it, period.
Okay. Well, the thing that's justified about it is the fact that we were not the only ones that were doing it. That a lot of the pile-up, particularly once the ballistic missile era got in the way, was because of deployments on the other side.
Well, Mr. Cumber, as I recall, and I just read this afternoon, one of your justifications, if not indeed your main justification, is that they might not work, so we have to have a lot of them.
It's not a matter that they might not work. It's that a lot of them will be destroyed before they could be used, if they were used at all. But
you also spoke of them landing on target but not detonating, or, missing the target, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and that's why we have to have so many of them.
Okay, now what I was doing, I was explaining how some of these things work and why we needed as many of them as we did. You also note that one of the things I said was, let's get off of this treadmill that we're on, and let's try and find a way, particularly with the ballistic missiles, which is something we can defend against presently or within a very short time. Getting off of this treadmill, we're not sitting there like 2 gunfighters aiming guns at each other.
Well, Mr. Cumber, taking a missile and putting a bomb on top of it and sending it 8,000 miles across the sea and dumping it, in downtown Moscow is a piece of cake compared with the technology involved in something like the Strategic Defense Initiative. I mean, it's child's play compared with SDI. And if you're concerned that we can't take a missile and send it 8,000 miles and drop it on a particular block in Moscow,
it's not a matter of we can't do it. It's a matter of will we have any left after Moscow shoots at us to be able to do it.
Does that make any difference if we do? I mean, that's the end of the world anyway, Mr. Cumber.
No, it is not. The nuclear winter people have some very grave difficulties with their theorization. But the main thing that I am saying is that technology, a lot of attention with SDI has been put on to lasers and particle beams and exotic things. We don't need anything exotic. We can use simple kinetic energy technology that is, in essence, the same thing as bullets. In fact, one of the defensive measures they were talking about for, say, defending silos consisted of a gun. And so these things are simple. They can be done. As a matter of fact, there was a project back in the late 50s, early 60s called Project Defender that actually went through all of these technologies and in essence came up with a concept for what we now know as SDI, but it was canceled basically for reasons having nothing to do with the technical viability of the project back in the early 1960s.
Why was it canceled?
63, 64. After the death of John Kennedy, there was a desire on the part of the administration to take and use money for domestic programs, which turned out in many ways to be nothing more than pork barrel projects, and a lot of that money was brought out of the defense program. And this is one of the things was canceled.
If you were sitting in the White House, Mr. Cumber, and it was brought to your attention that the Soviets were about to deploy their own version of Star Wars tomorrow, what would you do?
I think our only response in this case would most likely be something along the lines of the Manhattan Project. In other words, a crash program to get this thing together and get it up.
Mr. Cumber, I believe you say in your book that the Soviets are already far superior to us militarily.
Yes, they are.
And that if indeed they had their own Star Wars initiative in place, that would just be the end of the ball game.
In essence, it could be.
So if they were to put up Star Wars tomorrow and you were president, you would roll up your sleeves and start to work.
Well,
or would you let the missiles fly tonight and keep that from happening?
No American president could ever survive on an attempt on his part to execute a preemptive assault on the Soviet Union. Now, I'm sure...
Well, if the security of the nation was at stake, Mr. Cumber, I think it would be incumbent upon him to do so. Wouldn't you?
I would not say it would be incumbent upon him to do so. As a matter of fact, I would say that a president of the United States, if he was president of the United States, would have been very remiss to not be going ahead with an SDI program anyway, and never mind as far as the Soviets. If anything, stay ahead of the Soviets or stay at least equal with the Soviets so we would deploy simultaneously.
Well, of course, as our president tells us, and unfortunately speaks out of both sides of his mouth on this, one day the Soviets don't have it and they shouldn't worry because when we get it, we're going to give it to them, and then the other day they have a 15-year head start on us on this, so I'm not really sure which it is. But let's split it down the middle and call it a 7.5-year head start. Now, again, it would seem to me that if they were to put up a strategic defense initiative tomorrow, the intelligent thing to do would be, instead of our trying to develop one ourselves, would be to try to find a way around it.
The only problem...
Wouldn't that be the intelligent thing to do, Mr. Cumber?
You might think that it would be, except for the fact that when you understand the technologies, particularly if you use the lower technology solutions, the cost of building more weapons to outfox that are much greater than it costs to add more to take care of the weapons that you're adding from the offensive stint.
You had a guesstimate in your manuscript about how much it would cost per satellite for the Strategic Defense Initiative. Would you care to share that with the audience?
Okay, as I recall, it was something along the lines, and this is not my quote precisely, this was one I caught from when I was a High Frontier.
Yeah, Danny Graham.
Yes, and...
$200,000.
Yeah, $200,000 roughly.
Do you have any idea, Mr. Cumber?
No, that was not for each satellite. That was for each missile destroyed.
No, it is for each satellite. I've talked with Danny Graham myself.
Oh, okay. Then maybe I miscalculated.
Do you have any idea what it costs to put up a satellite that will switch phone calls?
Yes, I do, but these satellites we're using to put up phone calls are each handmade. They're not mass-produced items, as these defensive satellites would have to be. We have never made more than 10 satellites of any one specific design, and so consequently the costs of those things are astronomical. In the meantime, if you were to mass-produce
$300-400 million a piece, in many cases.
I've never heard it cost us $400 million. I've heard $50 million, but not $400 million. You might be including the complete life cycle cost, which includes the operations and the launch costs and everything else, mostly operations.
Well, that would have to be included in any satellite, wouldn't it?
True.
It still takes a missile to put it up there. And it still takes all of the preparation, and it still takes all of the backup units, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, this is a life-or-death system.
True, but again, you're talking about life cycle costs includes also the continuing operating costs of the ground stations and things like this. And we're talking about the aspect, and that's for any satellite. But at the same time, we're talking about an outlay over a number of years, and in any 1 year, it's going to be a lot less than what you might think.
Well, let's go back again and talk a little bit about getting around SDI. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe in essence you just told me that you're not worried about them getting around it because this is the end-all, be-all. That there's just absolutely nothing beyond this, correct?
No, I didn't say that.
Well, of course not. That would be a foolish thing for you to say. There is a way around it, isn't there? Let me put it this way. You could go around it if you're willing to spend the money to do it. But the cost of going around it, you could add more satellites cheaper than you can add more missiles to go around it. And of course, the administration has already told us in with Casper Weinberger as a spokesman for the administration, that even if we put up SDI tomorrow and we felt it was 100% fail-safe, which of course no one would even dare assume that it was, that still would not lessen our dependency on our conventional weapons as well as on our strategic weapons, that we would still need all of the missiles, all of the ships, all of the tanks, all of it. We would still need all of it. So all it is an additional weapon.
Now, well, as far as conventional forces, yes, because this is strictly a strategic system. But I think there would be a reduced need for some of the things we're doing in the strategic area, like C3I hardening, and as far as the number of missiles and strategic ballistic missiles, as this system becomes better, they will become less and less useful. There will be less and less of them until they completely are rendered useless.
I assume that you've been relatively influenced by General Danny Graham in your thinking along the lines of SDI.
Not just by Dan Graham, because I've got a bit of a background in both aerospace and astronomical subjects, so I understand the technology that's involved.
It's too bad Danny Graham doesn't, because Danny Graham's organization is the organization that put out that very controversial television commercial that in essence was a cartoon showing the rainbow shield over the country and the little girl talking to her daddy and saying, "Daddy, why do we need this?" And Daddy says, because it will put an end to nuclear war. It'll put an end to nuclear weapons, giving the very false impression that, first of all, it was a fail-safe shield, which it is not even close to. And secondly, that it would put an end to nuclear weapons when no such thing is even close to true. That High Frontier is little more than a public relations firm working for the defense industry. Is that not correct?
I would not say that at all. Okay. It is a,
but it's still put out a very false advertisement, did it not?
No, it is a public education outfit, but it is not related
to... It's a public disinformation outfit, Mr. Cumber. It's not... A space shield is not even close to what is envisioned for SDI. Not even close, Mr. Cumber.
Oh, it isn't?
No.
Okay. Let me explain something. First off, a 100% shield, while it may not be possible, is also not necessary. And let me explain why. The main reason that we don't need it to 100% effective is because the Soviet Union, being the one who would most likely launch a surprise attack, is looking for a type of attack that would allow them to destroy our nuclear capability on the ground before it is launched. Okay? And would allow them to eliminate our military capability.
You're sure of that? You're sure that's their objective?
That's from their own writing, sir.
Of course, you contend in your book that they're already vastly superior to us militarily. So it would seem to me, sir, that if that was their objective, and if they're already superior to us, they would attack tonight. They certainly wouldn't wait for us to develop some type of shield, would they, Mr. Cumber?
They would not want us to develop a shield, but at the same time, they want one so that whatever we send back would not get through. And they're working very hard on that. And that is probably the only reason why they haven't gone ahead with it, because they have been planning a nuclear strike for a number of years.
What is the likelihood, what percentage of missiles of ours would they knock out on the first strike?
With what they have now?
Yeah, with what they have right now. Tonight, if they were to launch, what percentage of our...
Okay, from what I know about what they presently have up, I would say that they could... Okay, that depends on the number we could get out, and it depends on whether we launch on one. There's several variables.
50%?
With what they have now, maybe 25. I wouldn't say 50%, but that's assuming that we launch on warning. If we don't launch on warning, they might be able to knock out as much as 75%.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, again, this is an estimate. I haven't actually sat down and done this sort of a calculation.
Okay, well, let's split the difference from the 25 to the 75 and call it 50, okay? We'll split the difference. A space shield, the most wildly optimistic estimates are 90% effective. The most wildly optimistic.
Yeah.
So, and there are some people that say 50% on that. So let's split the difference and call it 75% effective, okay?
Okay.
It's not much, what's the difference, sir?
What's the difference?
If 2,500 missiles get through or 10,000 missiles get through, what's the difference?
What's the difference? Okay, The difference is this, from the Soviet standpoint. They're looking for a way to wipe out our military capability on the ground before anything gets started. If we deploy a system that is even only 50% effective. See, right now, if they want to launch an attack, it's one of these deals where they put 2 warheads on each target, and they have over 90% capability of wiping out that target. If you add 50% defensive systems to that, they not only know they not only don't know if the missile's going to get through, they know they're going to lose 50% of what they send, but they don't know what 50%. So instead of having a simple arithmetic problem as far as their capability of wiping out targets, it now becomes a calculus for which there is no solution. And that, sir, is why you wind up with security, because they look at the situation and they say, there's no way we can attack this.
Okay, two very brief questions before we move on to the next area of discussion. First of all, you were convinced that this is the Soviet plan to attack this country at some point in the future?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Second question, how soon do you think it might be before there was an operational SDI in the sky?
That depends upon the actions of several different parties.
All-out effort. All-out effort starting today. How soon?
Okay, we could have a first layer which would protect our retaliatory forces within 12 to 18 months. We could have the beginnings of a global orbital type system that would intercept Soviet missiles as they rose out of the atmosphere.
12 to 18 months?
No, 12 to 18 months for the ground-based system to protect their retaliatory forces. It's a window closer, as it were. The global system, which would be able to protect both military and civil targets, and not just in the United States, but the world over, 3 to 5 years. 3 to 5
years. This is 1987, so, because this will be important a little bit later on, 1990 to 1992. With an all-out effort.
With an all-out effort.
Okay. 23 minutes after the hour of 8 o'clock, my guest is James Cumber. All right, you worked with NASA.
Yes, sir.
Care to tell me about that?
I worked in the Office of Aeronautics and Space Technology. I was an applications and graphics programmer, but being a space buff, I also found out, was there and could learn as much as I could about what NASA was doing as well.
It says here that you ran the OAST travel desk. What does that mean?
Okay, that was one of the things they had me doing. That was one of the time things. I kept their travel arrangements going.
Kept their travel arrangements going at NASA.
So they could they knew who was where and what and how. I also, at the same time, helped them put together the documentation on their automated resource system, which is what they use to keep track of what they're doing.
And you worked there for 4.5 months.
Right. It was a short-term contract.
Okay, you also were the assistant to the director, according to this, to Daniel Graham at High Frontier, correct?
Yes, sir, it was.
You were there for approximately 4 months.
Yes, they had a situation where they needed to get together materials for use to, in essence, get working with the college-age people, and they needed the stuff rapidly, so I got it done rapidly.
And your assignments or your duties there with High Frontier?
Basically, well, there were several different things I did there. Among preparing materials for use in their external use for working with colleges. I also kept track of congressional database of actions related to High Frontier. Also, another thing that I did was that I don't think I even mentioned there was the fact that one of the things I helped out with was that General Graham having a security clearance, there were some things he wasn't sure he could talk about. And I would keep track of the unclassified sources, and I'd be able to tell him, General Graham, you can talk about this because it's appeared in Aviation Week.
It says here that you also oversaw the preparation of brochures and posters.
Yes, sir.
And for a total of 4 months. Don't wish to be callous, sir, but it doesn't sound like you have a great deal of technical expertise in these areas.
Well, if you take a look at what was in some of the brochures, the High Frontier answer book, which talked about answers to various questions about High Frontier, most of that I prepared for the first one they had. The second thing was that the brochure that they are still using is based on the brochure that I put together, fundamentally, and it explains in very brief detail how this is supposed to work.
I want to go on to the second part of the manuscript here, and that's the one dealing with the Book of Revelation, which apparently has been a considerable influence in your life. Correct?
Well, I do believe in God, and so I read the Bible, and some things there struck me, and I started doing some research, and it struck me even more.
May I read from your manuscript?
Sure.
Part 6, Revelations. Quote, "And the fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star fall from heaven onto the earth. And to him was given the key to the bottomless pit. And he opened the bottomless pit, and there arose a smoke out of the pit, as the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit. And there came out of the smoke locusts upon the earth, and unto them was given power, as the scorpions of the earth have power. And it was commanded then that they should not hurt the grass of the earth, neither any green thing, neither any tree, but only those men which have not the seal of God in their foreheads, in their foreheads. And to them it was given that they should not kill them, but that they should be tormented 5 months, and their torment was in the torment of a scorpion, when he striketh a man. And in those days shall man seek death, and shall not find it, and shall desire to die, and death shall flee from them. And the shapes of the locusts were like unto horses prepared unto battle, and on their heads were as it were crowns like gold, and their faces were as the faces of men, and they had their hair as the hair of women, and their teeth were as the teeth of lions, and they had breastplates, and it were breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings was as the sound of chariots of many horses running to battle. And as they had tails like unto scorpions, and there were stings in their tails, and their power was to hurt man 5 months. Revelations 9:1-10. You ask a question immediately following that. This is a description of nuclear war?
Mm-hmm. And that was the question, as you'll note there in the section of the book, was rhetorical, because I think that it is a description of nuclear war.
The locusts.
Okay, well, as I explained, you've got to remember that John was a man of the first century.
Mm-hmm.
And assuming that you accept the fact that he did receive revelation of our day,
mm-hmm.
he is seeing things of the 20th century.
Of course, it wouldn't have had to be that way. God could have certainly, these were bizarre in the first century. It certainly wouldn't have been any more bizarre to the people to give an accurate description of what we would have to deal with 2,000 years later.
Yes, but then you've got to remember that John was a man of the first century trying to describe things he was seeing in the 20th century in first century terms, because that was the only reference they had to deal with.
Of course, John also thought that the end of the world was at hand. He says clearly in the first chapter that the time is near.
Well, then again,
2,000 years ago.
Yes, 2,000 years ago. But then again, at the same time, you've got to remember what's 2,000 years to the Lord.
Well, 2,000 years to the Lord is nothing, but certainly the Lord would be aware of our capability of judging time.
But one thing I've noticed as I read the Bible, it appears that oft times the prophets have a tendency to, as they look at these things, they gain this long view, as it were. And so consequently, a lot of times they look at things from a longer view than what we're used to.
Well, so that we might gain a better insight into the way that you look at the world, could we go through this explanation as to how you see this as prophecy of nuclear war?
Okay. Well, starting from the very first, it talks about a star falling from heaven unto the earth.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you take a look at a re-entering ballistic missile warhead, it does look like a meteor or a falling star.
Many things do, right?
Yes, many things do, but that's one of them. To him was given the key to the bottomless pit. Okay. And he opened the bottomless pit, and there rose a smoke out of the pit. If you've ever seen a film of what's referred to as a hot launch intercontinental range ballistic missile.
A hot launch.
What's referred to as hot launch. That means the missile ignites.
Phrase I think we should all remember.
It's a missile that ignites in the silo,
mm-hmm.
Rather than some of the more modern missiles where they are expelled from the silo and ignite in the air.
Hot missiles will be gone relatively soon, won't they?
Yes.
They're being phased out.
Well, they're not really gone terribly soon. It's going to be several years yet, because we're only replacing about 50 of them for Minuteman, or not Minuteman, for MX missiles. And then the small ICBM, which is not due out until the mid-1990s,
mm-hmm.
will replace the rest of the hot launch missiles that we
I thought you said in your manuscript that you're pretty much expecting them to be gone by 1989, the hot launch missiles.
What I said was that they would be obsolete and due for replacement by 1989 to 1990.
Okay.
And should be replaced by that time. In fact, our Minuteman II missiles should be being replaced because they are so old that there's some questions as to whether their guidance systems are going to be useful for very much longer.
Okay. Could we continue with how you see this as nuclear war?
And then what happens is when a hot launch ICBM, you see this silo, this hole in the ground opens up. And it looks like a bottomless pit because the missile itself is very deep in the silo.
Mm-hmm.
And then out of this pit comes this tremendous gout of flame and smoke. As they say, the smoke of a great furnace. Rose of smoke out of the pit is the smoke of a great furnace. And the sun and the air darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit. He may have been given a view of it from very close in which case, the
mm-hmm.
amount of smoke may have seemed to be quite large. And there came out of the smoke locusts upon the earth. Now, how, if you've seen a hot launch ICBM...
If you've ever seen locusts, they don't look anything like a missile coming out of a silo.
Unless they're flying along very quickly, like when they're swarming.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how is he going to describe an ICBM?
Oh, maybe as a snake coming out of the pit, or perhaps as a staff coming out of the pit, not locusts. A swarm of locusts covers acres at a time. They move in a body. They don't come out in a column straight up in the air.
No, but he wouldn't call it a staff either, because they're awful thick for a staff. An ICBM is a very thick item. He wouldn't call it, obviously, a telephone pole. He wouldn't call it a pencil or something like this, because he doesn't have that referent.
No, but he would have had the reference of a snake or a staff or something like that.
Yeah, but it's too thick for a snake. You see, it's too thick for a snake. And the other thing that's interesting is a locust in flight tucks his legs up under his body, his wings are beating very fast, and when he flies by you very quickly, as John undoubtedly had seen it...
Yeah, he tends to fly by you, not straight up.
No, but the shape of him looks very much in aspect and in thickness about like an ICBM or a missile.
Okay.
I mean, that makes a certain amount of sense if you understand the first century referent. Okay. Mm-hmm. And has given them power as scorpions of the earth have power, and has commanded them they should not hurt the grass of the earth, neither any green thing, neither any tree, but only those men which have not the seal of God in their foreheads.
Well, nuclear weapons don't hurt grass and earth and trees?
Well, let me put it this way. Vegetation is very radiation resistant. And if you go along further, they're talking here
Mr.
about...
Cumber, have you seen the pictures of the area around Chernobyl?
Yes, I have.
Well, then if you have, perhaps you would have noticed that the trees are all yellow and brown and dead.
When were those pictures taken?
After Chernobyl exploded, sir.
Yes, but
when
about...
the radiation...
Okay, but about when? Okay.
Even today. As recently, the last I saw would have been about 2 months ago, and they were still yellow and brown and dead.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of your... Yes, and you've got to remember, too, that Chernobyl put out a great deal of fallout. And in the area immediately around Chernobyl, an extremely high amount of fallout. But you've got to remember that in a nuclear war, most of the nuclear weapons will not be surface burst. They will be air burst, which does not put out anywhere near as much fallout as what you had at Chernobyl.
Well, the fact remains, sir, that nuclear weapons do affect the grass and the trees and the earth dramatically, don't they?
Not as heavily as they affect animals, and not as long... See, the longer distances, you'll have more radiation effects will happen as far as animals and plants, or animals and people are concerned,
well,
plants.
I would think that God, while giving this revelation to John, would have known that there is damage to plant life. I would think that God would have known that, wouldn't you?
True, but nowhere near as extreme as the damage among animal life.
And it would have been so foolish for him to throw in something like they should not hurt the grass, any green thing, any tree, wouldn't it?
Not totally. Okay, but that's... The point is not as major as you might think. What they're saying here
Seems awfully major to me, Mr. Cumber.
Okay. But what they're saying here is that they should not kill them, that they should be tormented 5 months, and their torment was the torment of a scorpion when he striketh a man. Now, what happens when a scorpion strikes a man? He injects poison or venom.
Mm-hmm.
And the man has the effects of poisoning. Now, radiation sickness was originally referred to as radiation poisoning.
Mm-hmm. Still frequently is.
Still frequently is. And in many ways, some of the effects do resemble some of the poisoning effects from venomous insects.
Except it doesn't go away in 5 months.
Depending on the exposure rate.
Mm-hmm.
The sickness, the actual heavy sickness, the vomiting and the other things from radiation sickness, sometimes, depending on the exposure rate, can have a time period of about 5 months. And
only for a group of people who happen to be a very precise distance away from an explosion. I mean, that certainly wouldn't be across the board by any stretch of imagination, would it, Mr. Cumber?
No, but if you're very close to the explosion, you won't even be allowed to suffer radiation sickness to start with.
Hopefully.
Well, that's a matter of fact. You can get that right out of the effects of nuclear weapons, which is virtually the textbook on nuclear weapons.
Of course, there has never been any broad-scale detonation of nuclear weapons on the face of the Earth at any one time, and so we really have no idea what would happen even to the people in another hemisphere weeks or months down the road as to how their water supply, for example, might be affected, how their milk supply, how their agricultural supply might be affected. We just don't know that. The best we can do is to play games in a computer and take educated guesses.
Well, basically, that's the problem with the nuclear winter crowd. They've taken educated guesses, which in some cases have been shown to be not completely correct. In fact, substantially incorrect in many cases.
Mm-hmm.
For example, I have heard and have a tape at home of Carl Sagan making the statement that as little as 100 megatons of nuclear detonation would guarantee the destruction of all life on Earth. And yet the Soviet Union detonated a warhead in 1961 in October of between 58 and 80 megatons over Novaya Zemlya. And there was hardly any effect that was detected outside of that area.
Well, of course, Mr. Sagan was talking about basically 1 megaton strategically placed multiple explosions in cities, and was talking about the fire that would have resulted therefrom. And, of course, the 50 to 80 megaton explosion that you're talking about was under very, very controlled conditions, and there really wasn't any fire. And, of course, we also know further that from those explosions back in the 1960s that took place 8 to 10 to 12,000 miles away, that there was a detectable and noticeable increase in radiation in milk in this country within days from one simple explosion thousands of miles away.
Now, you mentioned the point that the fact of fires. One thing that the Sagan group missed, which is very plainly stated in the effects of nuclear weapons, is that all the tests we have done where we have gauged for fire effect, we noticed a very interesting situation occurring. Yes, at the face of a flammable piece of equipment or target or whatever, a sudden flash fire occurred on the surface, but then the blast wave immediately following the ignition blew the fire out because it didn't have time to establish itself. And that's something that they missed when they did their homework.
Got to take a break at this point. Actually, I'm way behind on one. I'd like to come back and continue along these lines, if you will. My guest is James Cumber. We shall return.
The phone numbers that put you on the air at WPLP are in Hillsborough County, 224-0057. In Pinellas County, 393-0057. And anywhere else, toll-free, 1-800-334-0057.
Isn't it great when kids love something?
The time, my guest, James F. Cumber, Jr. Mr. Cumber, I'd like to pick up with the description and revelation of what you believe to be nuclear war. I think we left off with roughly the area where these locusts have the face of men, or the missiles have the face of men.
The shaped locusts were like unto horses prepared unto battle, and their heads were, as it were, crowns of gold, and their faces were the faces of men. Okay. Horses prepared unto battle. Our ICBM force is always T-minus 1 minute and counting. They're like horses champing at the bit, as it were. Heads, as it were, crowns of gold. On some of the missiles, there is an aerodynamic shroud, we sometimes call a nose cone, that is made of a wound aerodynamic fiber, or wound aramid fiber, that is actually golden in color. And it looks like a golden crown of the Egyptian pattern almost in some cases. This is available, actually. You can actually find books. They show these. One of them was Gunston's book on missiles and rockets. I can't remember the exact name, but I mentioned it in here, but I don't have that. Illustrated Encyclopedia of the World's Rockets and Missiles by Bill Gunston. 79 by Salamander Crown books. It has that. And the faces that were faces of men. The United States missiles have names like Minuteman, Titan, Poseidon. These...
He didn't say have the names of men. He said have the faces of men.
Well...
What, did he blow it again?
No, well, then again, too, I would consider this to be a situation where it's an analogy, I think, to the names that they are given. Now, whether the Soviets have names like this for their missiles, we don't know.
Yeah, I found that rather peculiar. I'll read directly from your manuscript. We do not know what or if the Soviets have named their missiles with such human names. That I find extraordinary, that you couldn't find out something that mundane, that easy to find out, since you know exactly what they're planning on doing and what their every thought and motive is.
Well, there's a lot of their stuff has been sent out to us by some agents we've had in place over the years. and things like this. But the problem with their particular thing with the missiles is that a lot of the information on their missiles, as far as their own, they won't even tell us. When we negotiated SALT II...
Oh, come, Mr. Cumber. You know their plans for world conquest will tell you that, but they won't tell you what they named their missiles?
They didn't tell me that. It had to be dug out from various places and from information that's been published in the United States by some people in our government that realized that this was something the American people needed to know, as far as, and other governments as well, that they needed to know what the Soviet Union was doing. And so they published in English translation, which can be gotten from the government printing office, some of the manuals the Soviet Union uses to train their own troops. Now, they also, the Soviet Union themselves, helped in this by publishing... for example, Grechko's Armed Forces of the Soviet State, where he says right in there, he says, if you want to know what we're doing, I'm paraphrasing now, I've got the exact quote here in the book, but I don't have time to dig into it. I'm paraphrasing. If you want to know what we're doing, look at our manuals we use to train our troops and look at the way we deploy our forces. And that will tell you exactly what we're planning to do. And this rings true because you will recognize here a military restatement of Marx's dicta that communists disdain to conceal their aims and views. So this sounds like it's got some truth to it because that's the way they think. You've got to remember that to them, Marx in many ways has replaced God.
Okay, let's continue. Hair as the hair of women, teeth of lions, etc.
Hair is the hair of women. Have you ever seen the umbilical cords that are connected to a missile before it is launched? It looks like the braid of a woman, like a braid of hair from a woman. And when you take a look, the teeth of lions, this one got me for a while myself until I talked to a missile technician who referred to safety pins within the missile that are approximately 4 inches long, about as big around as your finger, that are ejected once the missile is in space in order for the missile to arm itself. And the technicians themselves refer to them as lion's teeth, which almost made me lose my my cool completely on that one.
Of course, there weren't any lions roaming around the Middle East when John, the Reveler, was around, so he wouldn't have known about lions
yes,
either.
there were.
Oh, really?
The sheep herders. Don't you remember the stories of David and how he defended his sheep against mountain lions out there?
Well, mountain lions. Their teeth aren't that big.
Well, the mountain lion in the Middle East is more like our African lion, really. It's not exactly. The only difference between the African lion and these lions lived in a hillerier country than the African lion of the veldt does.
And were a lot smaller. About a quarter of the size.
Roughly. Okay. But he was still talking about teeth of lions, and it was a small lion. But even a smaller lion, those teeth are fairly large. Let me put it this way, I wouldn't want to have to sit there and face them.
Let's move right down to, because this is what I really find interesting, tails like unto scorpions.
Yes. If you take a look at a missile that is being launched, you see there are, again, in Gunston's book, he has some pictures of them. You can see there is a phenomenon that occurs in the exhaust called shock diamonds. And what it does is it makes the exhaust, if you take a look at it, if you see it from a close distance or through a telescope or whatever, so that you can actually see it, it makes it look, in some cases, particularly if it's a multiple engine missile, makes the interference pattern, makes it look like the segmented tail of a scorpion. Assuming a liquid-fueled rocket with a clear exhaust.
Hot exhaust.
Hot, yes, a hot or clear exhaust.
Yeah.
Well, hot, it doesn't make a difference. Hot launch, cold launch doesn't make a difference. The exhaust is the same.
Well, it seems to in your book, it seems to make a difference.
Well, the hot launch missiles were one thing, but the exhaust is not necessarily, does not depend on there being hot launch.
I mean, for example, cold launch missiles, Peacekeeper deployment began in late 1986 and is presently scheduled to continue until 1988 or 1989, if Congress doesn't scuttle it, and they haven't, and the State Department doesn't negotiate it away, and they haven't. So therefore, you go on here to conclude that the time's pretty close, huh?
Well, if you got to remember also that we're only deploying 50 peacekeepers out of a 1,000 missile force. So there's very few of our missiles.
Well, you asked the question here, could the time be that close? More on that as we go.
Yes, that's the question.
So the time is that close, as far as you're concerned from the book of Revelation.
Well, that's the question I asked. Now, I'm not saying that there is, if you will notice there, I don't think I answer that question.
Well, you say more on that as we go along. Unfortunately, I don't have the rest of the book, so what's the answer?
That's true.
Yes or no?
That's
time
a good question. the time is definitely close, but I don't know how close it is. I'm not giving an exact thing, although it looks very possibly from certain other indications I get from other sources.
Within a couple of years.
Within a few years.
Now, that I find awfully interesting. Here you are, a man who believes in the Bible, who is apparently quite fascinated with the book of Revelation. You read the book of Revelation and you see this not maybe situation revealed to John by God, but this definite situation revealed by John to God, by God to John, that is apparently just right around the corner, and yet at the same time you're advocating to me a system that couldn't be deployed until several years from now, quite a number of years from now, at best. And there is no indication that we're going to work at best at it. As a matter of fact, it would seem that we're probably going to cut back on Star Wars research, not speed it up, which would slow it down considerably.
Then that, sir, will definitely mean that we will have exactly what John predicted.
Well, I'm sorry, sir, but it would seem to me that we could put up all the Star Wars that we wanted, and if indeed you believe in the Bible, and if indeed you believe in the Revelation, then it doesn't make any difference what we put up. We're going to have it anyway, right? So isn't that kind of a silly, hypocritical position?
No. Even if we had one partially up when this came, I am looking at the aspect of saving as many lives as possible. See, right now, if the Soviet Union was destroyed...
Well, wait a second. Again, that really confuses me. If you're a man of God, the way that you save lives is not by building missile defenses, but let's go back again to the beginning of the chapter. And even the bottom was pit, and there came out the smoke, etc., etc. Let me see if I can quickly find it here. And it was given that they should not kill them, but that they should... okay, that's the wrong one. Well, actually, what I'm looking for, I'll just have to paraphrase it here since I can't find it, is that only the people who don't have the marks of God on their foreheads are going to die, and all those that have the marks of the forehead. So it would seem to me, sir, that if you're interested in saving...
not necessarily died.
Well, it would seem to me that if you're interested in saving lives and saving people from torment, you should be out baptizing people, not building a Star Wars missile defense.
Well, I think you can do both.
I mean, how, you're trying to get around the work of God?
No, I'm not getting around the work of God. I'm saying that you should do what is right.
Well, how is putting a space defense system up going to give people the mark of God on their forehead?
That's okay. It is morally right from any aspect to want to save lives and to do whatever you can to save lives. Will you agree with that?
Well, I would, sir, but I'm not the one who has a belief in the Bible. You see, because obviously it would not be morally right to try to save the lives of people that God doesn't want saved.
Okay. Well, God loves all his children, but the point of the matter there is, no, I don't think those...
God loves all his children? Did I understand you correctly?
Yes.
Okay, we'll come to that in a moment, too.
Yes, but the point of the matter is, he dislike a lot of things they do, but that's another thing entirely. But the point I'm saying is, it is any person of Christian conscience will want to save as many people as he can. Now, this means, of course, also...
By building weapons.
Okay, this is not... the term weapons here is used in a term that is very difficult to look at when you take a look at the defense system, because if you take a look at the way the SDI system, as I talk about it in the book to a certain extent, the kinetic energy devices, in fact, even your laser and particle beams, are designed in such a way that they cannot hurt anyone on the ground. They're designed strictly to destroy missiles. What we presently have is a so-called strategy called mutual assured destruction.
Mm-hmm.
The acronym is MAD, and it's the most apt acronym I have ever seen because it is truly insane to sit there and base your entire defense against weapons on the threat to destroy millions of people.
Okay, let me ask you to hold that for a moment. I will get to that, but I want to finish up in this area before we move on to that. It would be fair to say that you're a vehement anti-communist, correct?
I think that'd be, well, I wouldn't say vehement anti-communist. I would say that I have a great distaste for persons who come in and try
You constantly refer in your book to the satanic communists.
It is.
So are you vehemently against Satan?
Definitely.
And Satan and communism go hand in hand.
Obviously.
So why are you uncomfortable with saying that you're a vehement anti-communist?
I'm uncomfortable with it because it sometimes has a tendency to connote something that may not terribly be there. I am against communism, but I am not out there to slaughter people.
Well, the communists are led by Satan. Satanic communists. It's a phrase that you use constantly in your book.
True.
Okay,
but the point I'm making is that, is there some way that we can... My idea with the defense...
Were you trying to convert Satan?
No.
Well, I would hope not.
I'm trying to convert. There's nothing wrong with trying to convert his followers, is there? But you got to have time to do that sometimes, especially when time is so short.
Well, it would seem to me that if you firmly believe, and I would gather from your book that you do, that the communists are just completely dominated and controlled by Satan.
Not well.
Let us back up again a little bit in the conversation here.
The theory of communism is satanic in origin, and that goes into a section of the book which you don't have.
The theory of communism, satanic. That's interesting too. We'll get to that a little bit later on. But it would seem to me that if the devil or Satan or whatever you'd like to call him, Lucifer, makes no difference to me, is in control over there in the Soviet Union. A little bit earlier in the conversation, you were talking about the Soviets' concern for not attacking right now. I mean, come on, the devil's in charge. What's he care? I mean, if he has the power, and you would tell me that the Soviets are militarily superior to us, if he has the power right now, and the devil wants to wipe out this marvelous Christian God-fearing country, the United States of America, I mean, come on now, Mr. Cumber. So what if there's a little exchange here and some of the Soviet Union is blown up? What difference does it make to him?
Well, if you take a look at the way they actually do things, they don't have a tremendous amount, but the people who are in charge there want to save their own skins. I mean, they may want power, but they're not silly.
But they're mere mortals, Mr. Cumber. Satan is the second most powerful force in the universe, only next to God Almighty himself, if you believe what you tell me you believe.
Mr. Lassiter, hold on a moment here. Something can be satanic without being directly controlled by Satan.
Oh, how's that?
Okay, it can be the theory of government, for example, of communism, is satanic in origin. That does not say that the devil directly controls and tells Mikhail Gorbachev what he's going to do every day of the week.
Well, certainly Satan's powerful enough to do that, wouldn't you think? I mean, especially since Mikhail Gorbachev does not know the Lord. You know, he can't hold up a cross and drive him away, or utter some words and drive Satan away.
But, okay, my point is that the point I'm making is this. That is not... I won't deny that could be possible, but there are certain things in there that in the communist system that leads me to believe that I don't think that it works that way. It does not work that way.
The communist form of government. Could you give me a thumbnail description of the communist form of government? Role in planning.
Exactly. And that includes the force. You don't control things, you control people.
The philosophy, if you take away the militarism of it, the philosophy would be strikingly similar to that philosophy as uttered by Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount in its purest forms. Group ownership, jobs for everybody, housing for everybody, food for everyone, regardless of their means or ability.
That's what they'd like to have you believe. When you
take away the militarism, and that is the purest form of communism.
However, if you take a look at what Marx said, and he was the one that put together communism, he talked about the Marxist, the dictatorship of the proletariat and the socialist state, and he claimed it would wither away, but he never explained how this was to occur. And that was the big fallacy with the whole thing, because once you have a dictatorship in place, as we know from history, it never withers away.
How long ago did Karl Marx live?
1848. Actually later than that, but that's when he wrote the manifesto.
Okay, 125 years or so ago.
Mm-hmm.
130-some years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And he talked about exporting revolution?
Well...
Or did he talk about workers' revolutions springing up spontaneously all over the world?
True, and I will agree that he did talk about spontaneous workers' revolutions. However, we will also know that what has happened has been a situation where there have been modifications. If you'll notice, the
Karl Marx's system of communism and the current Soviet system of communism really don't resemble each other very much at all, do they?
I suspect that a lot of times the Soviet state is using Marx as an excuse for self-aggrandizement in the national sense. And if you will note, their system is referred to not as Marxism, but as Marxism-Leninism.
Okay,
accepting the modifications of Marxism that Lenin put in.
I'm just about out of time for this hour. You will stay with me the next hour, will you not?
If you wish.
Yes, I certainly do. Two quick well, that was one of them. The second quick question. You were the executive assistant to Daniel Graham, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Assistant to the director.
Assistant to the director.
Yes.
CBS News coming your way at the top of the hour. Don't go far. I'm Bob Lassiter. My guest, James F. Cumber, Jr.
You're listening to The Bob Lassiter Show on News Talk 57, serving Tampa, St. Petersburg, Clearwater. WPLP, Ellis Park. Stand by for CBS News.
7 minutes after the hour of 9 o'clock, Friday night, June the 5th, 1987. Bob Lassiter with you. Second of 3 hours. My guest in studio this hour, James F. Cumber, Jr. Mr. Cumber, you are aware of the fact, I would assume, that the president of this country, as well as many men in the administration, also hold very similar religious beliefs to yours, especially when it comes to Revelation, Armageddon, the final battle of Armageddon. I mean, for example, the president has said he thought it would come within a generation, 20, 25 years at best. You are aware of that?
I was not aware of that specific statement, but I knew that I held views were similar to those in the administration.
Would you understand if I said I thought that some of your views were a little bit peculiar, especially when it comes down to the Bible?
Well, may I say thank you. I'm used to being thought of as having a few ideas were slightly not exactly the same as what most mainstream have.
Okay, let me move into the third area that I wanted to discuss with you tonight before we go to the phones. You hold the belief that this is somehow a divinely inspired country.
Definitely.
That the Constitution, as an example, is divinely inspired.
Yes.
Even though many of the men who wrote the Constitution don't believe in the same God that you believe in.
Well, okay, now maybe that may be and that may not be. That's an interesting question. Well, it's an interesting question because my particular religious foundation, religious belief, and my particular religious denomination, if you want to call it that, did not exist at the time the government was founded.
You're a Mormon?
Mormon, yes.
Mm-hmm. But you believe in Christ?
Definitely.
Well,
Absolutely.
You are, of course, aware of the fact that many of the men who wrote the Constitution didn't. They were deists. They were not Christians.
Okay, now the deists believed in God, but they did not believe in organized religion.
Well, they didn't believe in Christ. They didn't believe in the Trinity.
No. Well, some of them didn't believe in the Trinity, but most of them didn't believe in Christ.
They didn't believe that the Bible was divinely inspired. They just thought it was kind of a nice book.
Well, I wouldn't go so far as to say that on some of them either. Now, you're talking about a great number of different men that were involved in the Constitution, and they had a widely diverse series of beliefs, and some of them probably did believe that. But most of your true deists believed in God. They just could not stomach the organized religions at the time. And in that, I would probably agree with them, because a lot of the religions that they disliked, I can't quite see myself.
Came across a quote in your manuscript. It really caught my eye because it's shown up a number of times, by the way, in the last couple of weeks in the Iran-Contra hearings.
Oh?
From Thomas Jefferson. The quote being, let's see, I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man.
Mm-hmm.
From Thomas Jefferson.
Thomas Jefferson. Yes.
A man with a rather peculiar set of standards. Thomas Jefferson was a tyrant. He owned, bred, bought, sold, and traded in human beings.
Well, if you remember, he also proposed that slavery be outlawed in the Constitution and was not listened to. He wrote from France, and that's a matter of public record. He wrote from France urging that slavery be outlawed.
I believe it was a little bit closer to slavery be phased out.
Well, in essence, the same thing. He wanted.
Well, no, it's not in essence the same thing. He wanted it done away with when his day was gone. He didn't want to get rid of his slaves, but he just didn't want you to own any slaves if you didn't already own some. But if you did, that was fine with him.
Well, I think what he did... Thomas Jefferson is an interesting character because he was... well,
they're all very interesting characters.
Yes, he was an interesting character in that he, in many ways, was like a rational anarchist that was discovered, and... Was
Ben Franklin inspired by God in the writing of the Constitution?
I think in some ways he was. Not all the... I won't say that every one of them were inspired all the time, but...
You probably you wouldn't have the vote if Ben Franklin had his way.
Oh, why?
Ben Franklin didn't think the common man had the intelligence to vote.
Well, at that time, there was also the prevalent belief of what's referred to as a natural aristocracy at the time as well. But the point that Franklin made, and I thought was quite a prescient point, was when they did get the Constitution, And they walked out of the hall there, and a woman asked Ben Franklin, "What kind of document have you given us, Dr. Franklin?" He says, "A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it."
Mm-hmm. Yes, I recall that.
And I thought that was a very, very significant statement as far as what is going on and the way things have gone. The thing that's inspired about the Constitution is that it does guarantee the freedom and the free agency of all men.
No, it didn't. It does now, but it didn't then.
Well, admittedly, they'd had faults when it first got started, but that was the basic intent.
Faults? Faults, sir?
Okay.
That only property owners could vote, only male property owners could vote, only white male property owners could vote, and no one else could. Everyone else was disenfranchised.
The main fault I found with that, the main fault, as you will agree, was the thing that it still admitted the existence of slavery. And I will agree that was a fault, and that is
the
one of the
existence of slavery was just one of the problems. It also considered women to be incapable of having any say.
I wouldn't say that. If you understand the basis of where it came from,
Well, I thought it came from God. The divine inspiration of God, sir.
True, but at the same time, if you understand the logic behind what they're doing...
I'm a little confused. How can there be a true but if you're talking about the divine inspiration of God? How can there be a true but?
Because God does have a logic to what he's doing.
Could have fooled me.
Well, you got.
What's the logic for keeping slaves? What's the logic for not giving black people any say in their lives?
Logical.
What's the logic for women not having any say in their lives?
That was not logical, and you've got to remember that oftentimes the Lord has to operate through men who are less than perfect.
Well, sir, I would dare say to you that someone who could create the universe from quote-unquote nothing, which is of course impossible, but that's neither here nor there, could certainly wiggle his nose or his finger or however he does these things and make man understand.
Okay. If you look back at the first verse of the Bible, Breshit bara Elohim, it is talking about in the beginning God organized. It was not ab nihilo. Unfortunately, that's a misconception. But it was organized. The earth was organized out of matter that already existed. But may that as it be, that's a side issue. The point I'm saying is...
Well, I thought God created everything.
Let me finish what I started to say the Constitution. The Constitution has the capability of being amended by the people. And that was really the genius, part of the genius, the real genius behind it. Because the Constitution, although it was the concept of free agency, of liberty, was the inspired kernel of the Constitution, there were parts, the slavery issue being specifically one, that should have been done differently.
So the Constitution wasn't perfect?
Not when it first came out. It was not absolutely perfect.
How could a perfect God inspire something that wasn't perfect?
The perfect God did not inspire that which was not, let me put it this way. A perfect God did not give an imperfect inspiration. It was imperfectly received by imperfect men.
Who created the men?
God did, but men must have their free agency, and this is what the war in heaven was all about.
Well, that's all. We may get to that later too, but let me see if I understand this correctly. Man is imperfect.
Yes.
Correct? Man is imperfect.
Man is imperfect.
And man is a creation of a perfect God. Well, obviously a perfect God couldn't possibly create something that was imperfect, sir.
Okay. Man is imperfect.
Or hadn't you ever thought about it that way before?
No,
hadn't you ever thought about any of these things before?
Yes, I've thought about these things before, but I think about them in a slightly different way than you're thinking about them. Okay. Man is not and never was intended to be God's puppet. God never intended man to be a puppet. God gave man his free agency. And this is the purpose of Christ in the atonement, is because man having his free agency, man would almost inevitably make mistakes. And so some way had to be gotten so that man could bring himself back to where he should be.
So then, in other words, we really don't have any idea at all as to how much, if indeed any, of the Constitution was inspired by God.
Oh, yes, we do. And we do have that from various forms and various parts of Scripture. It explains what was inspired about the Constitution. And what I just said, the ability of man to have his free agency to choose what he will do, Whether he will...
Well, 1 second, that scripture that you're talking about, that would not be scripture that's in my King James Version of the Bible, would it?
Okay, this particular
That was scripture that was, quote-unquote, found maybe 50 years after the Constitution was written, correct?
Well, it was revealed at that time, but there are...
revealed, found, I mean,
within the Bible, there are intimations of this. For example, Moses was told, I can't remember exactly where in the scriptures, I remember the scripture, but I can't remember where I read it, proclaim liberty throughout all the land and to all the inhabitants thereof. I believe that was in Exodus, come to think of it.
Mm-hmm.
But
of course, there wasn't liberty throughout the land back in Moses' day. Well, the Jews had slaves. Hell, the Jews even enslaved themselves.
And they also had a provision for release after a certain amount of time period.
For the men.
Yeah,
because women were property. Women were traded, too, as well back in
No,
those days.
not under Judaic law. They weren't traded in the form that kind of...
Well, there wasn't a market where you bought and sold women, but a woman was owned by her father until she was married, and then she was owned by the husband, unless either the father or the husband decided to just throw them away, in which case she was then on her own.
Okay, that unfortunately is a...
So it's not much liberty, is it?
That's not... Okay, that's not the Lord's plan, I'll put it that way. That
wasn't the Lord's plan.
That was the way men, unfortunately, interpreted what was meant.
How could Moses couldn't possibly have interpreted it, because Moses came down from the mountain with these laws from God. Moses didn't sit around and read through a book and say, I think that's what God meant. God told Moses unequivocally what he meant.
The first set of plates, the first set of tablets that he brought down from the mountain, what happened to them?
Well, he broke them, sir. But they were only the commandments. They were just the commandments. They weren't all the laws. The laws weren't on those first set of tablets. I mean, for example, God told Moses in no uncertain terms the formula for a perfume. God told Moses in no uncertain terms how to go to the bathroom in the desert. I would think that God would have told Moses also in no uncertain terms how to deal with women and slaves. I mean, if he went to so much trouble as to how to make perfume, I think he would have also told him how to deal with men, don't you?
Yes, but then again, too, what happened, a lot of the practices you talk about, were they what were actually done at the time period? Were they what was done while Moses was alive, or was that things that happened later? Even Christ himself made the statement of how the Jewish people had strayed, unfortunately, from
we're not talking about what the Jewish people did. We're talking about, the first 5 books of the Bible, Deuteronomy, Numbers, Judges, Exodus. That's what we're talking about, these divine laws from God. And, that's not really what we came here to talk about either.
Complete. I assume you're aware, of course, the Bible is not complete.
Well, I'm aware of many things about the Bible. I was just very curious as to, and we're really getting way off the track here about the divinely inspired Constitution of the United States of America, which, by the way, you would like to see with a line item veto amendment, correct?
I would think that would be a good way of controlling the budget, because...
Why don't you think God thought of that 200 years ago?
Well, he may have thought of it, but I don't think the word got through to the... You've got to remember that it's difficult sometimes to communicate with people who don't have a referent. I think God knew that we would need something like that, but to the Founding Fathers, such an idea was inconceivable, that sort of an arrangement, because a lot of the things that we have done now have been done differently than what they were used to seeing in those time periods. And so they would not understand that particular concept. But the idea of a line item veto, I think, is a good one, because there's a lot of things that are put into these bills, riders and amendments, for strictly pork barrel projects that we can easily do without. And it would eliminate a lot of budgetary mismanagement and a lot of budgetary cost.
You think the commies are led by the devil or connected with the devil in some way, correct?
Okay, the concept of communism, eliminating the free agency of man, that is the satanic idea. That's what the war in heaven was all about.
Okay, you call them a secret combination, communism and Satan, right? Do I understand that
The term
correctly?
secret combination includes more than just communism. But the concept of a satanic secret combination is one that is all too common, unfortunately, in the world. And there's more than one.
You talk about secret combinations. Definition would be oaths for secret murders are part of a government's let's see, a commitment here, et cetera, things like that, right?
Okay. Secret combinations are those that are built up to get power and gain for their members, whether that gain be power, money, or whatever. And they are not afraid to kill to gain these ends, that they are not afraid, and they try to keep the existence of the conspiracy secret.
Very similar to like our covert operations in this country.
Well, unfortunately, all too often that does become the case when covert operations are done, but there are some things where you have to maintain a certain degree in a political, imperfect world, a certain amount of secrecy.
22 minutes after the hour of 9 o'clock, my guest is James Cumber. Now, we've got Star Wars for you, we got the Book of Revelations, and we got, God and the commies. I'll open up the phones at this point. Hillsborough, 224-0057, 224-0057, and Pinellas, 393-0057, 393-0057, if you would like to comment on or question or whatever. Mr. Cumber, my guest. I'm Bob Lassiter. We shall return.
To join in the conversation, the number to call in Hillsborough County is 224-0057. In Pinellas County, 393-0057. Caphedrine.
25 minutes after the hour of 9 o'clock, my guest, James Cumber, Jr. To the phones we will go. Hi there, Clearwater. You're on the air at WPLP.
Mr. Lassiter.
Yes, sir.
First of all, compliment. I think that Sam Donaldson and Ted Koppel couldn't do any better on the interrogation that you've done. The only thing that I'd like to say to Mr. Cumber is this, and you brought it out, God bless you, 4.5 months as a contractor doing graphics for NASA, and he's going to use that as a crutch for his whatever it is. God, hopefully he doesn't do that, because I personally will go out.
Well, let me see if I can't wrap this up into a neat package. Mr. Cumber, I think in essence what the caller is saying is he's questioning your credentials to be making such statements and even, publishing a book.
Well, I have... That's not just the whole thing. That's just part of it. I have been interested in space and student of space. I have studied a little bit of aerospace engineering, a lot of astronomy. And
how old are you, sir?
38.
I put 32 years into aerospace research and development, and if you think that you can get by with 4.5 months and use that as a crutch to propagate whatever you're trying to propagate, I think that it really impinges on my integrity and my attempt toward doing what I could for my country. And for you to have 4.5 months as a contractor doing graphics.
Sir, I'm not trying...
You can get these bulletins, and you can get all of these beautiful, magnificent literature that NASA puts out. You can read about it like anybody can.
Well, we all know that. Let him respond, please,
okay,
caller.
I'm not trying to...
Don't use NASA as a crutch.
Caller, I'm sorry, but I did ask you politely to let him respond, so go ahead.
Gee, I'm not trying to impugn anybody's contribution. I'm not sure exactly why the gentleman was upset. I congratulate him on 30 years working for aerospace engineering firms and things like this. I'm just saying that from studies that I have made in a number of areas, and my major in college was an interdisciplinary social sciences with emphasis on the Soviet Union and the Middle East, that through a great deal of study over a number of years, over 20 years in fact, I have come to some conclusions that frankly concern me. This book I've written, I wrote because I felt I had to write it. It's not something I enjoy doing. Believe me, it's not.
One line open in Pinellas, 393-0057. Tampa, you're on the air at WPLP.
Mr. Cumber, a couple of questions for you, if I may.
Sure.
The foundation for which you now work enjoy any access to the Oval Office?
Okay, I don't now work for them, okay? As far as access to the Oval Office is concerned, minor, I would say, probably access. One time, General Graham was a campaign consultant on military policy with President Reagan when he was running for office. But he didn't go to the White House on a regular basis, believe me.
I'm curious, the reason I ask, I'm just wondering if you have any reason to believe that President Reagan used SDI in the same biblical terms that you've set forth tonight.
Whether he sets forth in biblical terms, I don't know. I'm looking at it from my particular perspective, from my experience, and I don't know. I honestly can't answer that question as to how Reagan looks at it, because I just don't know.
It seems from what I've read, I mean, Reagan's leanings are certainly those of a fundamentalist and really a dispensationalist, that there's a certain order to things, and I would have thought he might ally himself with you or you with him.
Well, I support his support of the SDI, if that's what you mean, purely on grounds of it's the right thing to do rather than to continue to just...
Even though the world's coming to an end shortly.
Well,
Bob,
that doesn't make any difference. You should still do what's right no matter what comes along.
Bob, have you read or heard anything to answer my question about whether Reagan sees Star Wars as an ordained approach?
I've not read anything along those lines, but I am familiar with a number of statements the president has made in past years that would indicate that he does believe that Armageddon is around the corner. He has literally said he firmly believes it will be within this generation.
Okay, curious. Thank you very much, folks.
Thank you. Hillsborough 224-0057, Pinellas 393-0057. Gulfport High, you're on the air to WPLP.
Hi, first I want to say I don't believe in Armageddon because I'm a pragmatic pantheist. But I do want to tell you, Gas, I want to congratulate him for holding his ground with you, because not many people could stand up to you like he has. That's it.
Okay, was that all you wanted to do, or did you have something else you wanted to add?
No, that's all. Thank you.
Okay, St. Petersburg, you're on air, WPLP.
Good evening, Bob. Love your show.
Thank you.
And wanted to bring up 2 points. Mr. Cumberson brought up a point about earlier in the...
Cumber, not cumbersome.
Oh, sorry about that.
No problem.
But brought up that he thought initial Star Wars defenses could be implemented within 18 months. Is that correct?
Yes, and now I made it I thought I tried to make it plain that 18 months was for a very limited window closing type defense of strictly ICBM silos that would eliminate the possibility of a first strike.
And with an all-out crash effort.
Well, that wouldn't need to be necessarily a tremendously all-out crash effort.
Well,
that part of it wouldn't. But the idea of defending the population takes an all-out crash effort of 3 to 5 years, yes.
Well, the thing I want to bring up is approximately, I believe it was 2 years ago, the Caspar Weinberger decided to can the Sergeant York gun, spending about $1.2 billion, I believe it was.
1.8.
Oh, sorry. And if I recall, like I said, I'm not an expert on any of this, but just trying to remember things about it. But the Sergeant York gun was an air defense weapon, if I'm correct.
Yes, it is, or was.
For low-level incoming aircraft. And that couldn't do that. But how is what you're saying going to shoot down a missile?
Okay.
If we don't have the technology to shoot down a low-flying aircraft.
Okay, it's a fair question. The thing that you're missing is that the Sergeant York gun, unfortunately, was...
You had made reference to a gun-type device.
Yes, but not the Sergeant York. A proven weapon that's already in service in anti-cruise missile roles, and I believe it's the Dutch Navy, our own Navy is even looking at it now, is something was originally referred to as the EX-83, and it is a turreted version of the GAL-8 Avenger cannon that is used on the A-10 attack plane to destroy tanks. They know that, and they've already tested this much, they know that a single round from this gun impacting on an incoming warhead would just tear it to pieces. Now, inasmuch as Soviet...
If it hit it.
Yeah, that's the thing, because the Sergeant York gun was supposed to be the same type of a defensive weapon, that it was technology that was already available, and they were trying to implement it into a new system.
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Cumber, but it would seem to me, from what I understand, that from fired in space at a high velocity, a pea fired from a pea shooter would cause an incoming rocket to explode.
Oh, yes, definitely. But I could probably show you the figures on that. But the point I'm making is with the EX-83 arrangement, This was designed, and I was there when General Electric presented this idea. This is designed to defend just an individual silo. Now, the reason it has an easier time than the York would have is very simply, the Soviet Union does not yet have, and is not expected to develop for some years, a sub-launched missile that can attack a missile silo, which means that anything going at a silo would be an ICBM warhead. And in order to hit the silo, it has to come in over a rather restricted area from the north. And within this area, the amount of rounds that we put into this rather restricted cone, because the requirement of accuracy to knock out a silo makes it a very tight corridor. These things have to come down.
Excuse me, could I correct you on one thing? In order to most economically be fired, it would have to come through a relatively restricted area of the north. There's no reason why they couldn't fire it around the South Pole.
Yes, but they don't have missiles with that kind of range.
Yeah.
What about sub-launch?
Sub-launch doesn't have the accuracy. They wouldn't attack silos with it.
I'll leave whoever's listening so they can draw their own conclusions. One other thing I wanted to bring up, that you were stating that to deter a first strike capability, I believe you and Mr. Lassiter had come up with a figure that 50% would be destroyed.
Well,
missiles, our missiles, if the Soviets launched a first strike attack against us, you estimated approximately 50% of our ground launch forces would be lost. Is that...
No, that's not what I said. The question, if I
thought it
correct
was.
me, well, maybe I misunderstood the question. The question was, if we were to launch a first strike against the Soviet Union, how many of their missiles could destroy what we? How
No,
many?
it was quite the other way around. If they launched a first strike against us.
Then I misunderstood the question at that point. Were they to launch a first strike at us, and if we were to follow the policy we have had for a number of years of not firing our missiles until Soviet missiles had actually landed on United States territory, we would lose well over 90% of our ICBM force.
Would that be our total ICBM force, or would that be our ground launch?
It's the ground-launched ICBM force, and we'd lose over 50% of our submarine force because they're in port at any time.
But that's true, but if I recall reading an article, one Trident submarine, there are enough nuclear warheads on one Trident submarine to destroy every major target in the Soviet Union.
It's over 200 warheads on one Trident.
There's over 200 warheads on one Trident, but there's there's over 150 military installations of the Soviet Union. We don't even know what they are.
Yes, but to effectively render the country inoperative, to strike at their transportation and manufacturing centers.
That assumes, one, that a Trident submarine will be able to get all of its missiles out before it was itself destroyed, and that all of those missiles were able to penetrate Soviet defenses.
It's amazing that you're so willing to concede the vulnerability and the possible technical breakdown of the existing weapon systems, but you seem to just automatically assume that this pie-in-the-sky Maginot Line is going to function flawlessly.
Okay, now that's... okay, I'm not talking about a pie-in-the-sky Maginot Line, quote, Maginot Line. That's another story entirely. But the point I'm saying is there are certain aspects about Soviet defensive systems that have not been brought out very well that indicates that there is a greater possibility. So they spend a 1 ruble on defense for every ruble they spend on offense. And through certain violations of the ABM Treaty, they have a far greater capability for anti-missile defense than we have. In fact, we have none. Zero. We have no defense against ballistic missiles.
And I believe the only facility that the Russians have surrounds Moscow, if I am correct.
That's the only one that they're admitting for SALT purposes. What they have also done is they have tested their SA-5 and SA-10, and I believe it's SA-12 surface-to-air missiles in the ABM mode and proven them capable of intercepting at least our sub-launched missiles, if not our ICBMs. And that gives them several thousand additional. They've also produced some 3,000.
How many how many Trident submarines do we have?
5, I believe. No, below that, 8. Yeah, I think it's about 8, although I think the last one hasn't actually gone to sea yet, still on trials.
Roughly how many warheads are we capable of firing from submarine-launched missiles or submarines? Trident missile, or how many Trident submarines do we have?
5, I believe. No, below that, 8. Yeah, I think it's about 8, although I think the last one hasn't actually gone to sea yet, still on trials.
Roughly how many warheads are we capable of firing from submarine-launched missiles? Or submarines?
Missiles or warheads?
Warheads.
Warheads? Okay.
Yeah. Several thousand, isn't it?
Yeah, several thousand. But that assumes that all fired.
How many delivery vehicles do the Soviets have?
First off, with the submarine-launched ballistic missiles, remember that 50% of our subs are in port at any time and therefore vulnerable to a first strike.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Secondly, the question is how many of our submarines would last long enough to fire their missiles, because there's certain developments in Soviet ASW that have not been well publicized that leads me to be very concerned about the vulnerability of our submarines. Now, this is a subject we haven't gotten into yet.
Again, this just absolutely amazes me. Thank you very much, caller, by the way. This just absolutely amazes me. These, good-for-nothing commies over there in the Soviet Union are being led by Satan, who obviously wouldn't have any problem whatsoever with suffering some losses of Russians. I mean, give me a break.
Mm-hmm.
And they're so superior to us and so forth and so on, and we're so inferior and so weak, and I just don't understand why they just haven't pushed the button.
It's a reversal of position has taken place since 1960. In essence, or from the 1960s till today.
Uh-huh.
And there has been, like I said, the people who are involved in the Soviet Union the leadership wants to assure their survival.
Of course, again, the leadership would be powerless to act if Satan influenced them. They'd be powerless to not act, but powerless to resist.
Well, you're looking at, like I said, the idea of the Soviet government and the Soviet state is the denial of free agency. And that is what I refer to when I say satanic.
Well, it sounds to me like a lot of double talk. I mean, we either have Satan or we don't have Satan over there. Which is it? Is Satan influencing over there or not?
Oh, definitely. He influenced the government itself is a satanic form of government in that it denies man his freedom, his liberty. And this, the satanic...
Daniel Graham was a friend of and a consultant to the President of the United States.
During his campaign, yeah.
And you were an assistant to Daniel Graham.
Not during the campaign.
No, not during the campaign, but you have worked as an assistant to Daniel Graham. Thank you, sir.
The phone numbers that put you on the air at WPLP are in Hillsborough County, 224-0057. In Pinellas County, 393-0057. And anywhere else, toll-free, 1-800-334-0057.
How long have they been on? You're back to the phones we go. Hi, Tampa. You're on the air at WPLP. Well, in that case, let's go to Apollo Beach. You're on the air at WPLP.
Good evening, Bob.
Good evening.
Mr. Cumber.
Yes, sir.
I want to make sure I understand what you said tonight, the fact that you do believe in the Bible, you are a Mormon, and that you do believe in Armageddon. Is that right?
Yes, I do.
And you also said that the President and people of his administration feel the same way.
Well, I have heard statements that tend to indicate that some of them do feel that way. Not all of them, obviously.
And so, therefore, the fact of Armageddon is the fact that we are going to have an atomic war. Is that not right?
Yes, I believe fervently that we will have an atomic war.
Or an attack of locusts.
And therefore, you also believe then that we should initiate Star Wars and strike those Satan Russians first. Is that right?
Star Wars is not offensive. We could not strike anything except prevent ICBMs from striking us.
Well, I beg your pardon, sir. I beg your pardon. It is an offensive weapon.
It certainly is.
Absolutely. How can you say how? Offensive how?
It would be an offensive weapon if it prohibited the Soviets from returning the strike.
Exactly right.
That's not an offensive weapon.
Well, it's part of an offensive weapon system. It would be part of an offensive weapon system if you knew beforehand that you could strike your opponent, and your opponent, therefore, would be incapable of striking back. And if your opponent was the devil, and if you believed that the devil was an evil guy, then it would seem to me it would behoove you to try to get rid of the devil, wouldn't it?
Well, your aspect of looking at things is not the same as mine,
Mr. Cumber, if you had the ability to strike down the devil as a good Christian, God-fearing man, wouldn't you do so, sir?
Striking down the devil is one thing. Striking down human beings is a slightly
Well, if the human beings were doing the work of the devil, wouldn't you also slay them?
I would rather restrain them from harming others as much as possible and try to get them unglued from the satanic course they are following.
Well, then let me see if I have this correctly. You would allow people to roam about doing the work of Satan.
No, I would say try to limit what they can do as much as possible within the bounds of the Constitution.
So, in other words, you would allow people to roam around doing the work of Satan, even if you had the ability to strike them down.
All men must have free agency. Okay. Let's start with that. All men must have free agency. It's what you do with these people when they've done
Cumber,
these things.
I feel as though I should be able to offer you some sand so that you could tap dance without getting your shoes all scuffed up there.
White man speaking with forked tongue.
I mean, if you had the ability to strike down people doing the work of Satan, shouldn't you do it as a good God-fearing Christian?
There are laws. If the laws are broken, the laws should be enforced. That's simple.
But you said we're going to have an atomic war. You said that, and that's what Armageddon says. And if that's the case, then why in the hell wouldn't we strike them first? And and Star Wars would prohibit them from striking us, why would we sit here and allow those Satan communistic Russians to strike us instead of us? And that's the purpose of Star Wars. Now, why don't you admit it?
That is not the purpose of Star Wars.
What you just said.
That's what the Soviet Union is trying to say is the purpose of Star Wars. Star Wars will not harm a single person on the ground.
But it will keep us from being harmed.
It'll keep us from being harmed, yes. Don't you think that's a good idea to keep us from being harmed, sir?
And the administration is lying to us, and what's going to happen is we're going to get Star Wars.
Well, wait a second. Let me jump in here. I think I just noticed something.
You see what I'm getting at?
Star Wars would keep us from being harmed.
That's right.
But for God's word to be fulfilled, there must be
an atomic war.
An atomic war, right?
Okay.
Right, Mr. Cumber?
That's why I don't believe that we will ever get the SDI up completely, if at all.
But you said
Just because I don't think it will happen does not mean that it is not the right thing to do. The idea of having a defensive system based on truly keeping people from being killed.
But does General Graham feel the same way, too, by the way, about Star Wars, that it won't get up there to stop the war in time?
I don't think so. I differ with him on that.
Let me tell you something, Bob.
I think, but
This man was no director under Graham, either.
I did not say. I said I was an assistant to him.
You said you was an executive director under
No, I corrected Mr. Lassiter. I said I was an assistant to the director, which is General Graham.
I think you worked in the mail room.
Say what?
I think you worked in the mail room.
Well, there's no need to try to insult my guest.
Well, I'm not trying to insult him, Bob. The thing about it is, everything he said is available to the public. And what gets me is these people in the administration and people like this that are lying to the public, that they're going to put up this Star Wars. They believe in the Bible. They believe in Armageddon, that we're going to have an atomic war, and we're going to hit them first and cause the whole damn world to be exploded. That's what's going to happen.
I can't talk about what other people believe, but I can tell you very positively, sir, I do not at any time believe that this country should ever first strike the Soviet Union.
Oh, well, let us sit here and let them hit us then, right? That's what you're saying.
No.
It has to be one or the other, buddy.
No. Yes. I say that's why I want to put up the SDI, is to defend us so the Soviet Union can't hit us.
Well, you see, Mr. Cumber, that's one of the areas that I'm just so confused about. You tell me that you believe in Satan, that you believe in satanic powers, and that you know where Satan is hanging out, and you know who he's hanging out with, and yet you wouldn't do anything about it. That just seems to me to be astonishing.
I wouldn't quite put it that way. I wouldn't quite put it that way. But it is not...
It would also seem to me, too, from what I understand of your belief, sir, that it would be just as effective to go over there and hold up a crucifix as to put up Star Wars, because if indeed this is, a satanic government and a satanic power over there, that would drive them away.
Yeah, you don't really understand where I'm coming from on that. But it is not... I don't think I don't believe any of your listeners would go to the point of saying... The gentle carpenter of Galilee did not believe in striking your enemy's first strike type situation. I'm sorry, killing innocent people.
I beg your pardon. Sometimes he didn't, sometimes he did.
Oh, yes, he drove the money changers from the temple, but they had committed an offense.
He also told his disciples to go out and get swords.
Yes, he did, but at the same time...
They also told some people to take their swords and turn them into plowshares.
True.
They also told some people to turn the other cheek.
What he was saying was...
I don't know what he was saying, Mr. Cumber. He said everything.
No. The first off, there are certain things that are worth fighting for. Liberty, your belief in God, if it's threatened, if someone is coming after you to try and force you to not worship God in your own way. That is worth fighting to defend. There are some things that are worth fighting to defend. The concept of the just war. A defensive situation is justified. As long as you have not given offense, there is no reason to allow yourself to be wiped out. But there are personal slights and personal faults. That's not something you fight over.
Well, let me see if I have this correct. The communists want to take over this country. They want to take away our liberty, and they want to take away our religious freedom, correct?
Yes.
And you don't want to do anything about it?
No, I did not say that. If I didn't want to do anything about it, I wouldn't do anything about it.
You do want to go and strike them?
No. I want to defend the country, but I do not want to attack the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons that will kill a lot of innocent Russians who are the worst victims of communism.
Do you think there's any possibility, sir, that the Soviet Union could get its way and take away our liberties? Do you think there's any way do you think that's a possibility?
Yeah, I think it's a possibility they would try.
So you think it's a possibility?
I think it's a possibility they would try.
Well,
whether they would do it or
my question was, do you think there's a possibility that they could? Yes or no?
If we sit by and do nothing and do not try to contend with them, yes, they could.
It's a very simple question. I'll ask it one more time. Do you think there is a possibility, however remote it may be, but do you think there is a possibility that the Soviet Union could take over this country, strip us of our liberties and our religious freedoms?
Yes, it's a possibility, but only under certain circumstances.
And with that possibility there, you would rather gamble that they would do that if you had the ability to stop them than to actually act and stop them.
Okay, I would stop them, but I would not stop them by slaughtering innocent Russian people, if I could help it.
Well, we don't seem to have any problem with slaughtering innocent Nicaraguan people to stop the spread of communism. We didn't seem to have any problem in slaughtering innocent Vietnamese people to stop the spread of communism. I don't see why all of a sudden innocent Russian people...
The Russians don't seem to have any trouble slaughtering innocent Afghans and innocent Cambodians.
we all know that.
And innocent Mosquito Indians.
We all know that to be true, sir. We all know that to be true. That wasn't the point of the conversation. The point of the conversation is, since we haven't had any moral problem with slaughtering innocent people to stop the spread of communism in other countries, I frankly don't see why all of a sudden we become very moral people and don't want to slaughter innocent Russians.
Well, let me put it this way. You're talking about, you're looking at me as if I'm the government in the fact
No, sir,
I'm
looking at you because you wrote this book and you're making the statements.
Yes, but I am not saying, I have said nowhere in there anything about first striking the Soviet Union, and that is not my intent. The entire intent of my support of SDI is to prevent Americans, as many Americans as possible, from being destroyed. And I frankly think that having a defensive system makes more sense than basing one's defense upon the immoral threat to slaughter X million Russians in response if they slaughter X million Americans.
I'm sure you know what an oxymoron is. An oxymoron, yes, that's a statement that just doesn't make any sense. Defensive weapon is an oxymoron. There's no such thing, sir, as a defensive weapon. Weapons are all offensive.
A defensive weapon is a weapon that is designed to destroy offensive weapons and not destroy people. And that is the interesting thing about the SDI, is it's a paradigm shift. For the first time, it is possible to really talk about a weapon that is not designed to kill people.
SDI is a three-pronged system. First prong of the system would be the kinetic energy.
Mm-hmm. Second
prong would be the space-based laser weapons. Third prong would be ground-based weapons, last resort for those missiles coming through that the first two missed, correct?
Well, the question of whether whether lasers would ever be a part of the system is a technological one.
It's what they're working at the hardest right now.
True.
Now, if you can put a laser up in space that can shoot a missile a few feet off the ground, and that's what the lasers would be there for, then you could also put a laser up in space that could shoot out buildings.
No, it's not a few feet off.
What do you mean, no, Mr. Cumber?
It is not a few feet off the ground. A laser, if you take a look at laser propagation experiments, you will find out they've noticed several effects that make them very unsuited for work within the atmosphere.
Mr. Cumber, what would trigger the laser-based, or the laser weapons? What would trigger those?
The detection of Soviet launches by infrared emissions of the missiles after they left the sensible atmosphere above 30,000 feet.
They burn out almost immediately at that point, don't they?
No, they do not. You still have quite a bit of time. 30,000 feet, they haven't even burned out their first stage yet.
Well, I sir, have watched a number of launches on television, and I can easily remember, for example, something as big and heavy and cumbersome as